Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Jake Krilovich. I'm Executive Director of the Home Care Alliance in Massachusetts. We appreciate you joining us here today for a Home Care Caregiver Onboarding, Improving Engagement and Retention webinar. The webinar is hosted jointly here with Viventium, who's one of our allied members, but also a great supporter of our association and many of the things we do. Some of you may have seen, and if not, we will be sure to send it out after the webinar, a recent report that Viventium had commissioned. And so the aim of today is to have a quick rundown of the report by Tara Vicario, who is the Chief Marketing Officer of Viventium. And then after she's done with her presentation, we're going to go into a panel discussion with two of our member agencies, and there will be opportunity for you to ask questions. And we're just going to talk about their experiences onboarding, as well as things in response to the report. So I will hand it off to Tara, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Jake. All right, I'm going to just hide my camera here. We'll be back on in a second because I want us to be able to focus fully on this study. So thank you so much. This has been a really exciting experience because we really wanted to dive in to ways that we could really address retention. And we really believe that onboarding is where it all starts. So let me start by saying we have a celebrity here on this slide that you'll see. So you can say Jake's quote at the very bottom. But, I'm excited here to bring you a first of its kind research study. We've gotten great reviews, and you can see it's across the board from different industry leaders in post-acute care segments, and even clients who've said, wow, this is really helpful information. We know that your first ticket to retention is through the doors of onboarding. So for those of you who've never joined a webinar, I just want to introduce myself. I'm Tara, and I'm very passionate about the employee experience. And quite frankly, in the post-acute care industry, it matters more than ever. We have an opportunity here to collectively raise the bar for employees, which ultimately benefits not only our caregivers, but also our most vulnerable. We don't want to lose these caregivers to the other industries that are out there and record trying to steal our caregivers. So let me get into what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to take you through a high-level overview of the retention problem that we're facing, which is no surprise to you at all. Then we're going to get into a little bit about the study. From there, we'll go into, sort of the findings that we have and the overarching takeaways. And then I want to leave you with some practical remedies that you could go put into place like today. I would encourage you all to download the study. We'll make sure that you have an easy way to get a hold of that. Okay, so as many of you are probably familiar with already, it's difficult to retain quality caregiving staff. So according to research by Home Care Pulse, the home care industry has a 77% annual turnover rate. And we likely have grown accustomed to hearing about high turnover rates. It's year over year. They're not getting better. They're getting worse. But when you compare this to the US turnover rate across all industries sitting at 17%, it kind of leaves us all wondering what makes it so difficult for post-acute care organizations to retain staff. And this is a very important question to answer because the ramifications of this problem are hurting organizations within the industry. Home healthcare providers are having to turn away over 25% of referred patients due to these staff shortages. Nursing care facilities aren't doing much better on the staffing front, with employment being about 13% lower than before the pandemic. And we all know the baby boomer generation is aging and beginning to require home, facility, and community-based care. The gap between the number of patients and families seeking assistance and the availability of staff is accelerating at an unsustainable pace. And so as an owner, manager, admin, what are you supposed to do about this problem? In this industry, we know you will always be onboarding caregivers due to the demand. I'm just here to tell you today that we can make a significant difference on caregiver retention by bettering the onboarding process. So before we hop into the details of what we found, let's talk a little bit about the actual study. So in Q4 of 2023, we surveyed 220 caregivers and 175 administrators working in post-acute care industry across the United States. And this includes home, facility, and community-based care organizations. we asked them questions about their onboarding experience with their current organization. There are so many studies showing the importance of high quality onboarding and its relationship to retention and productivity, but none of the studies that we've ever found have specifically looked at post-acute care. We suspected there was a difference in the perception between caregivers and admins when it comes to the quality of onboarding standards within the industry, but we wanted to know not only how, but in what areas, why it's different, because this would allow us to point towards a potentially easy to implement solution for admins and managers to increase retention, and also provide insight into the current state of onboarding in the industry to discover what we can all do to make this better. So to give you a quick overview so you can understand our respondents, here's a breakdown of the industry, position, and tenure with the current organization. So as you can see, we have a variety of diverse backgrounds. Our admins primarily work in either skilled nursing, home health, or home care. Majority of them hold a senior leadership or director title, with the remaining group being manager, supervisor, or HR specialist. 41% have been with their current org for over 5 years, with the rest of the pie being made up of less experienced admins. So let's switch over to the caregiver respondents. 73% of the caregivers were from either home health or home care, with the remaining being in skilled nursing, assisted living, independent living, or hospice. 26% were caregiving vets with over 5 years of experience, but overall, a fairly even distribution of tenure on the caregiving side. So as far as primary responsibilities go, wide range of backgrounds varying with from companions to CNAs, RNs, PCAs, CHHAs, and LPNs. So now that you know who we studied, the question remains, what did our research actually find? So to begin, we wanted to ask a simple question. How was the onboarding experience at your organization? Caregivers then would be able to select excellent, good, fair, bad, or horrible, which would then dictate if their organization was going to be considered an onboarding leader or an onboarding laggard. And we were at first really pleasantly surprised by the results. Nearly 2/3 of organizations were receiving excellent or good responses, placing them as onboarding leaders. This meant, in general, caregivers actually perceive the industry standard as relatively positive. But like anything, when you dig deeper, this perception of a positive versus negative onboarding experience turned out to matter a lot. Our report discovered that caregivers at onboarding leaders, the ones whose caregivers had a positive onboarding experience, would go on to have a much more positive view of their employer and are much more satisfied with their day-to-day work when compared to caregivers at onboarding laggards. And this was huge because what it actually meant was that we had a lever that agencies and facilities could pull in order to have a real impact on their staff's perception of them as an employer. And we had real life industry specific data that supported this theory. So for the first time, good onboarding in post-acute care has now been proven to correlate directly to a strong employee-employer relationship, which other research that was not in the industry shows that it leads to greater employee engagement, reduced absenteeism, and overall improved retention. But don't be fooled just yet, because when we looked at the data from the previous slide, we found that 63% of caregivers were working at onboarding leaders. So that puzzled us a bit to say, why would the industry have caregivers who are satisfied with their onboarding, yet have low retention rates if these two are so closely linked? And the answer became apparent. It was that what was considered good or excellent by caregivers was based on their experience with other post-acute care organizations. And when you unpack what that actually meant, it turns out that in this industry, the bar is shockingly low for what good onboarding looks like. I'll give you an example. Even amongst the onboarding leaders, the best of the best, over half of caregivers never received a warm welcome when joining their organization. So perception wasn't lining up with reality. So to better understand this dynamic, we needed to look at the onboarding standards in the industry, and we wanted to know what's working, what isn't working, how attitudes differ between caregivers and admins on different topics, and then how to do onboarding better starting right now. So that analysis brought us to 3 overarching takeaways. Our first takeaway goes back to the idea that better onboarding in the post-acute care industry drives greater job satisfaction, improved performance, and a more positive perception of the employee experience. So as you can see in this first chart, onboarding leaders were significantly more likely, the caregivers at onboarding leaders were significantly more likely to feel as though they have opportunities to advance their careers. This is an important factor to consider when thinking about ways to increase retention, because high achieving caregivers who want to progress need to feel as though they can do so without needing to change employers or even industries. So where onboarding laggards might be falling behind is that they might not even be clearly communicating career progression opportunities, and they may exist within your organization. They just might not know. So remember, this is perception. So even if you as the manager understand what it takes for caregivers to progress, they need to be able to understand it too. In a similar realm, the chart on the right shows how caregivers perceive their work-life balance at their company. So 90% of surveyed caregivers at onboarding leaders rated their work-life balance as very good or somewhat good, compared to only 34% at those at onboarding laggards. And this is a real staggering difference, with many difference for why this may be the case. The way that I see it, giving new hires benefits like remote onboarding, where they can complete paperwork easily at whatever time is most convenient for them, sets the tone for how new hires, view work-life balance and this perception that they can do things when it's more convenient to them. So giving them access to some digital resources, up-to-date versions of policy documents like handbook, takes that ambiguity around process and employee benefits out of it. Regardless, the fact remains that organizations with a strong onboarding process have caregivers who feel as though they have greater opportunities for career advancement and better work-life balance. So because of that, it's pretty easy to start to see why onboarding can drive greater retention. If you can advance in your career where you already are and you have good work-life balance, why would you look elsewhere? Of course, it is also likely that companies that invest more resources to create a better onboarding experience will be more likely to invest in other areas of the employee work experience as well. So that's to say, while onboarding is definitely a piece of this puzzle, you also have to actually provide other benefits in order for you to feel like you have career advancement and work-life balance. The second overarching takeaway is that caregivers and admins tend to perceive the quality of onboarding in the industry pretty differently. So let's take a moment to remember we're all here just to examine the data and figure out what to go do with it. And sometimes this can reveal some interesting things. So without talking about it, we can't fix it. And if you're watching this thinking, you know what, I'm an owner, I'm a manager, I'm an admin, and we have a pretty good onboarding process, you wouldn't be alone, because 68% of admins said that their onboarding is either industry leading or ahead of the competition. Now, when you look at this question from earlier of how was your onboarding experience, only 21% of the caregivers actually rated their onboarding experience as excellent. We see this correlation between being industry leading and ahead of the competition and excellent kind of going together here. So you can see that, admins think it's okay, caregivers see room for improvement, and there's a little bit of a disconnect here. The third and final takeaway is that by rethinking the nuts and bolts of onboarding and automating much of the process, admins can focus on more personal approach, which we know everybody would love to do. So research shows that when managers take an active role in onboarding, employees are 3.4 times more likely to strongly agree their onboarding experience was exceptional. And I actually love this because it shows that they want engagement. They want your time and attention. So how do we achieve this? To me, it just means taking time to get to know your new hires on a deeper level than just their start date, who their first client's going to be, because we know everybody, time is of the essence, right? It's about making real connections just behind, not just being the name behind who's helping them get through this, but, taking a genuine interest in their personal and professional well-being. And after all, how can we effectively onboard every new hire the same way and expect them to thrive? When you think about it, depending on their background and work experience, you may realize that you're wasting everyone's time by assigning basic training to a 30-year caregiving vet. And on the other hand, you may realize that your standard process is moving far too quickly for somebody who might be a fresh graduate who doesn't know how to fill out a W-4. And experience is only part of this puzzle. 40% of caregivers don't speak English as their first language. So we may think we're providing a fine onboarding experience, but it can be really hard for non-native English speakers to, to start to fill out paperwork that we ourselves don't sometimes understand, right? So with that being said, I want to share this stat with you here. Post-acute care admins spend an average of 49 to 68 hours in order to fully onboard a single new hire. And that is wild to me. The most tenured admins with over 5 years of experience are still taking over a full week's worth of hours to fully onboard a single person. So while the obvious problem is that time is money, the other more often overlooked issue is that this leaves less time for actually interacting on that personal and personable level. So earlier we briefly touched on noticeable difference between onboarding leaders and laggards. And when it comes to employee experience throughout their time at their organization, we want to dive a little bit deeper into what does it really mean. So if you want all of the findings, because there's a very long list of these, I'm only going to be sharing a few. In the onboarding study on page 22, you'll see all of the different dimensions of this. So as I mentioned earlier, caregivers at onboarding leaders report a significantly better work-life balance. So caregivers may be more likely to leave your organization for another job if they're struggling to juggle their work lives and their personal lives. This doesn't need to be anything extreme either. So a large part of why onboarding leaders have a higher reported number of caregivers with better work-life balance could be as simple as they understand the options available to them. You might already be providing flexibility that allows for better work-life balance, but if you don't explicitly communicate, and communication seems to be this overarching theme, caregivers may have a poor perception of the situation than is actual reality. Our second call out is job security. So 83% of caregivers at onboarding leaders feel secure in their employment compared to only 44% at onboarding laggards. So imagine walking into a new job and you're immediately thrown into the fire. You have sort of an idea of what you're responsible for, but for the most part, it's learn as you go, which also means learning alone. Nobody has explicitly given you clear goals or job expectations. How do you actually know if you're doing well? So in this environment, you're bound to feel as though you might be missing something, or your manager is just waiting for your replacement to apply. Caregivers are working, as we know, paycheck to paycheck, and they just can't risk going a week or two without pay. So the second they see something that makes them feel like they're not secure, they might already start searching for work elsewhere, or at a minimum, be willing to hear about other opportunities that come their way. And the worst part of this is that they might be doing a great job, and maybe you never even intended on replacing them. And in fact, it's probably likely, but they just don't know that. This brings us to our third point, which is really around caregivers at onboarding leaders reporting a higher rate of feeling adequately recognized for their contributions. We all know recognition matters to most people. This also comes down to clear communication. It's such a theme here. We talked about how digital onboarding and policy documents help with work-life balance and job security by providing that flexibility. With the information they need to understand how to take advantage of your company's benefits and policies, feeling recognized for their contributions and accomplishments is really no different. The setting of clear expectations and then the goals also provide them something to work towards to keep them focused on what it is that you want them to achieve. And then this allows for you to recognize them. So without the expectations communicated clearly at the start of employment, how do they know what they're working towards? And if they feel as though they're being taken care of, they'll want to stay longer. Oftentimes, recognition comes down to a caregiver's immediate supervisor. And what we found was that the caregivers at onboarding leaders, let me click again, are 36% more likely to feel they have support from their immediate leaders. So what does this mean? It means that getting to know your immediate supervisor or leader during the onboarding process makes for a much easier transition from a new hire to a long-time employee. So the level of support you feel from your immediate manager matters more than anything, because this is going to be who you're dealing with throughout your employment with the company. You often hear people say the number one reason they stay is the people. So when asked about whether or not employees were currently searching for a new employer, caregivers at onboarding leaders were significantly more satisfied with their current organization. So let me lay this chart out for you. You can see here the categories of actively searching, passively searching, not searching but open, not searching satisfied, and not searching stuck. The biggest indicator here for retention is in that fourth category that you're looking at, not searching satisfied. Look at the difference between onboarding leaders and laggards in this category. Only 13% of caregivers at onboarding laggards compared to 41% at onboarding leaders. So what that means, 87% of caregivers at the onboarding laggards could be out the door tomorrow. And while we'd love to see this go up across the board, this clearly highlights how a strong onboarding experience isn't something that only matters during the onboarding period. It literally sets the tone, for the rest of their employment. First impressions are important and lasting. We all know this, and it could be the difference between keeping staff for months or keeping staff for years. So this is my favorite part of the webinar because, one of my favorite quotes is action creates clarity. And so when we jump right into fixing these issues, you'll be able to react and learn, what should I do next? Your organization is unique, and the solution for each one of you is going to look a little bit different. So to get you started, we compiled a list of 7 very practical remedies you can administer to begin curbing the symptoms of this retention crisis. Okay, so first, speak their language. Remember earlier when I said 40% of caregivers regularly speak a language other than English at home? This makes for a fantastic opportunity to show them that you understand and you want to make onboarding easy. So providing onboarding documents in multiple languages, depending on common foreign languages like Spanish, Chinese, Russian, documents can easily be translated using a translation service, and a good digital onboarding platform should have all of the multiple languages options available, especially the most common ones. Onboarding can be hard enough already. I literally can't imagine having to complete forms in a foreign language. In addition to improving this caregiver onboarding experience, it might also cut down on some questions and errors that come along with language barriers for you. The second is show up in real life. So 69% of caregivers need or want to talk to someone during their onboarding time. So for some, this may be like the earlier example of a person who needs their hand held, walking them through their first ever onboarding process. And for others, this could just mean what it takes to make them feel more comfortable when starting a new job. At the end of the day, the reason isn't important. What's important is that this is your first chance to make a real human connection with your new hire in the organization. So I know this is something we can all relate to. Remember back to that first day of school feeling? I mean, I remember not being able to sleep the night before at all, thinking about things like, what do I need to bring? Who am I going to eat lunch with? Are people going to like me? Would people tell me if I'm going to the wrong classroom, especially by the time you get to middle school or high school and switching all the time? This isn't that different from onboarding. So following up on a similar train of thought as the last remedy, the third is to get personal. Don't just be available if they reach out to ask questions, but try to use this time to get to know new hires. This is a new person joining the organization. Welcome them to the team, ask them about their interests, plant the seeds of a relationship that's going to be longer and deeper than just that onboarding phase. Even just 5 to 10 minutes of real conversation with new hires can completely change the onboarding dynamic. You can set their nerves at ease by just chatting, making them excited to be here, meeting people, and connecting through stories, learning about them, their why. I'm never surprised when somebody's like, why are we in post-acute care? There's always a story behind it. But if you can't do any of this, you can't do any of this without going with the flow here. So the flow means a well-organized workflow that frees up time. So using a digital onboarding solution can help make onboarding easier for new hires and admins alike. So 41% of caregivers perform onboarding paperwork independently. I'm not saying to go completely automated here and have admins nowhere to be found. Like, digital can't handle all of it by itself, but it's about being efficient with our time. With a manual paper-based process, yes, you're interacting with your new hires, but we would kind of classify that as low value interactions. You're not really building the human connection that we talked about in the previous 2 remedies. Digital onboarding software with automated workflows can move those low value time tasks like filling out paperwork, collecting documents out of the way, and allow for more time to be spent with high value interactions. The thing here to remember is that when it comes to onboarding, digital and in-person work best when used together. There's a place for them both in the process. Okay, the fifth remedy is tend to training. So this was a little shocking to me. Even among onboarding leaders, only 43% of caregivers felt as though they received comprehensive training during onboarding. So this sort of goes back to this idea of building confidence that your caregivers are meeting expectations. Um, it kind of, when you think about it, it's really scary to walk into a job not knowing that you feel trained and ready to go, especially, this role is a really tough role. When you're a caregiver, we know they're dealing with some situations they might not have encountered before, and we just want them to feel prepared. So setting your caregivers up for success by providing them with an adequate level of training can make them feel ready to perform at a high level. And then, you see how it's all connected. Once they feel ready to perform at a high level, then you get to retention by recognition and all of those things we talked about before. So onboarding is filled with confusing documents that need to be filled out. If your new hire has been working with their last employer for a while, this is probably the first time in a few years they've had to think about a lot of these documents. In fact, 83% of caregivers need at least some form of assistance when completing their tax documentation. Having an admin available to answer questions not only shows new hires that you're available, but it also provides a smoother onboarding experience that helps, because you think about it, caregivers have questions. They don't get them answered. They fill out the paperwork's wrong. Then you have to go back and say, hey, the paperwork's wrong. And it actually is not an efficient use of admin's time either. So when you have a digital onboarding solution, this shouldn't take as long, as it walks them through completing paperwork step by step. And you really only need to be there to answer questions as they happen. So finally, the last, seventh remedy here is to get payroll right. Many caregivers are living paycheck to paycheck, and the payroll mistakes can absolutely flip their world upside down. One of the fastest ways to ensure a caregiver is going to be out the door is to mess up a paycheck, right? So especially in the first few months when they're trying to build a positive rapport as a great place to work, you're trying to make sure that they feel comfortable. Even the basic of mistakes like being late or underpaying can permanently damage a relationship. You may be thinking we got payroll under control, but if you look here, only 40% of caregivers strongly agree that they understand how their employer calculates their pay, and only 41% strongly agree that their employer calculates their pay accurately. So this is a problem that can be nipped in the bud during the onboarding by walking them through exactly how their pay structure works, what rates they should be expecting, and then keeping information stored in an easily accessible place, such as the employee self-service portal. At the end of the day, your staff is working for their paycheck. Make sure they feel confident about it. And it never surprises me to, when we talk about the payroll accounting equation, right, of gross pay minus taxes minus deductions equals net pay. So many people still need to be reminded, well, you're not going to take home exactly what your gross pay is, and here's where that money is going. So implementing these solutions and improving the onboarding experience is a win for everybody. Caregivers will report higher rates of job satisfaction and work-life balance. Admins will spend less time on manual data entry and new hire processing. And owners are able to save time and money by no longer having to be constantly replacing staff as they leave. And while you may only be one person, and we realize this, all of the remedies are something that you could easily implement and handle yourself. In fact, when done right, it will probably save you more time than you even had before. So as job satisfaction increases for caregivers and more stay within the industry, our hope is that we're not bleeding staff like we are today. The result will be an ability to take on more cases, and therefore everybody wins. At the end of the day, this isn't about us. It's about the lives that are touched by the hard work and dedication of our caregivers. I know you are passionate about this. Every time we talk to somebody in the industry, we're reminded that somebody has a story. And some of those stories are about a parent, grandparent, aunt, uncle who either received outstanding care or completely fell through the cracks. And regardless of the outcome, people want to advocate for better care. So the road is not straight, but we can all agree that helping each other and traveling together is better than going it alone, which is why in a few minutes we'll get on the panel here. Before we do, I wanted to just share with you, Viventium is here to support your onboarding program through technology. As you know, technology is one of the two vehicles to help deliver great onboarding, and you are the second, right? By keeping the process organized through automation and visibility, we can elevate the standards of this onboarding process and get more people to that personal and personable we spoke about earlier. So hopefully you've taken some of these strategies to improve your onboarding. We have a lot of information. It's jam-packed. I tried to cut down and just get to the real core points here in this webinar, but we really encourage you to scan the QR code and access the full report or request a demo of Viventium. So I think we're going to share our cameras here and get into our panel discussion. So back to you, Jake.
Thank you, Tara. That was excellent. And like I had said, I hope folks will access the report, read it. That was a good summary, but the report itself is about 40 pages long, but a difficult read, a lot of graphs and infographics. So I encourage you, and we will be sure to send it out after this. So now I will introduce our panel before we get started. And like I had said, if you have questions, we want this to be a free-flowing discussion. Raise your hand or put a question in the chat and we'll get to it either at the end, and whether it's about the report itself for Tara or about the panel or any questions for the panelists, we will get to that. So I'd like to introduce the panelists. Paul Pirelli is from Viventium, and I'll let the panelists introduce themselves as well as their agencies. Ryan McInniff is the owner and founder of Minute Women, a private pay agency in Massachusetts. And then Catherine Babinski is the Vice President of Human Resources at Brockton BNA. So thank you to the panelists, and I'll let Paul introduce himself first, and then we can go to Ryan and then Catherine.
Hey everybody. So I oversee New England specifically for Viventium, and I've worked with roughly about 200 to 300 agencies throughout New England, whether it be the payroll, recruiting, onboarding. One of the biggest things I try to specialize in is kind of reducing the manual workload that the administrative team has to deal with, and then just really improving the caregiver experience across the board.
Hello, everybody. My name is Ryan McInniff. I'm the owner of Minute Women Home Care. Just to correct Jake, I'm not the founder. My aunt started this company in 1969, so we've been going on for 55 years. We specialize in dementia care for mid and late stage dementia, and excited to be part of the panel and to hear everybody's feedback.
Thanks, Ryan. Good morning, everyone. My name is Catherine Babinski. I'm the Vice President of Human Resources at Brockton BNA. We are a home care, hospice, and palliative care agency that has been serving the Southeastern community for about 120 years. And I oversee all of HR, onboarding, etc. So I'm excited to talk about this today.
Great, thank you, everyone. So, the first question we wanted to talk about was what really spoke to you within the report, and I'll allow either of the providers or Paul to speak up. For me, I know it was mentioned in that quote. What really struck me in the report was just how many of these solutions are easy to implement, next week, right? From simply giving a warm welcome to a new caregiver, and then the other thing that struck me was just the variance in the data and how much more successful the onboarding leaders are in retaining their workforce than the laggards, right? These aren't just 5 or 10% more likely to retain your workforce. In some of the cases, they were 35, 40% more likely to retain a caregiver for more than 90 days. So curious, Catherine or Ryan, what you thought about the report or what struck you?
Thanks, Ryan. What really resonated for me was that we have to it's so important to get this right quickly, because we invest so much time in trying to recruit and get staff, which has been challenging at best with COVID. So then we get to the next step to bring them in. And if we're not doing that correctly, they're looking around, they're not satisfied. And what I saw in the report was that it's very simplistic, having people understand how their taxes are formulated, how they're paid, basic questions, and really helping that person to identify the go-to person and where that person is. But really, for me, above all, it's communication. I actually just prior to this meeting was in a meeting earlier this morning with a big team talking about onboarding, education, human resources versus the manager versus the clinical educator, and who has what role. And if we don't get each of the roles correctly, we've failed, and that person's already looking. So we want to invest in that person's education, and what's critical is their onboarding and starting on day one with that warm welcome. And for us, it's going to be communication. We need to do a better job and have a clear expectation. Case in point today, this week we had 3 new hires. One person showed up at 11 o'clock because they did not have clear communication from somebody letting them know what the expectations were. So we failed, and we need to do a better job, because if they're not clear on what our expectations are, then they're going to be looking elsewhere. And we want to be able to provide the best service available to our patients.
Thanks, Catherine. Ryan?
Yeah, the 2 things that stood out to me, or 1 or 2 things that stood out to me, was the graph about the amount of time it takes to onboard, and the longer that takes, the worse net promoter score you'll get. And so that kind of resonated with me, that people want to fill out paperwork, they want it to be streamlined as quickly as possible. And then that allows us, if we can streamline that very quickly, to have a really great onboarding experience. But then we can use that extra time for training, or for development, or for retention, and making them part of the team, rather than just filling out a bunch of paperwork and going through some of the processes and procedures that a company has. Maybe we can take that time to invest in our caregivers with training, and with making them feel part of the team, rather than just someone that might be disposable. The other part that I noticed that I thought was really interesting was the statistic that 39% of caregivers have doubts about the accuracy of their pay. I mean, talk about a way to get somebody to leave you for another job, and it may not be for a valid reason, right? I'm sure we've all had caregivers that call up, say, you're not paying me the right amount of money. And then all of a sudden you realize that the disconnect is they don't understand the difference between gross pay and net pay. And so those concerns and those questions should be treated just as a customer service question from our clients and our families, so that they feel comfortable that, hey, listen, when I'm working for Minute Women or whatever agency that you're running, that the accuracy of the pay is great. Because we all know, if we were to miss 1 payroll, or God forbid 2 payrolls, that's pretty much the end of our agency. So obviously we're not in that position right now. But on an individual level, if 40% or close to 40% of caregivers are questioning the pay that they're receiving on a week-to-week basis, that's a big concern that I would have, and want to nip that in the bud as quickly as possible.
Can I just jump in, Jake? So Ryan, when we had our discussion, a week ago, one of the things that I noticed when you said that, it really hit me hard. And I was thinking, you know what? We are at our core payroll and HR. And so I just want you to know we're almost done developing something that all agencies would be able to help explain pay, with a really nice infographic on how gross minus taxes minus deductions equals net pay, to help you reinforce that message. So I think it is important what you said. And, Catherine, kudos to you, because I honestly, admitting, like, listen, with that person who showed up at 11 and taking feedback, one of the stats that was on that page 22, which I really just love so much, is that we asked the question, payroll and HR provided an opportunity for me to offer feedback on the onboarding process. And literally 25% said that they had an opportunity for feedback. And we all know that hearing directly from the caregivers on just a couple things that we could do better could make a real impact. So I think that taking a look at it and then asking people at the end, how was your onboarding experience? What could we have done better? Will yield some really great input.
Thank you. Yeah, and Paul, I welcome your thoughts here on what struck you from the report. Like me, you're not a provider, but I do know that Viventium is, responsible for the payroll of over 450,000 caregivers across the country. So curious what struck you, and how you think what you guys are seeing on your end from this.
Yeah, Tara kind of stole my thunder. So the page 22, write it down, mark it. If you read the onboarding study, it is an eye-opening. There's about 15 to 20 behavioral items that are in there. Receive a warm welcome. 41% of people received a warm welcome. Like some simple, basic human element things that you kind of look at as like a manager or an owner, and you say, I can't believe somebody would come into our organization and not receive, like, whether it be an owner, administrator, executive, hey, thanks so much for taking the time to even think about working for us. It's a human element piece, I think, that's crazy. And then the last one on there was, I was invited to a social event to meet people in the organization. 11% of the home-based caregivers said that. If you were a leader, it was 17%, and if you were a lagger, it was 9%. So basically, from a social standpoint of, this is my company that pays my bills, the organization I work for that puts food on the table for me, not seeing anything from any kind of additional outside of work type thing. But I'm probably sure there's plenty of, on the administrative side, there's probably a ton of social events that happen. I work with an organization in Connecticut every year. And obviously this might be something that financially might not be a thing, but they actually do like a block party in the parking lot. They bring a food truck in, they invite all their caregivers, they invite everybody. And it is very much a really cool moment when the owner of an agency and a caregiver or their managers, they're all having a beer, having a laugh, sitting out, having a conversation. I mean, those are like the two that like jump off the page. But from an administrative point of view,
well, let me just touch on that one too, because what I think is important to note about the one he brought up was that nobody's doing it. So even if you just had 1 or 2 things a year where you did a pizza party or you did something, it's not about those things being all day, every day. And it's not the things that are the most impactful, but that the agency next door is not doing that. So.
Yeah. And then the other one from an administrative point of view, no-show percentages are a huge issue. So from a digital point of view, you can see in real time, and there's a ton of applicant tracking and onboarding platforms out there. If you're not using something that you can see in real time, what's being filled out, time-stamped, and being able to be proactive in, hey, so-and-so didn't fill out 3 or 4 pieces of onboarding. It might be worth, orientation's on a Friday. You're already having that conversation on the Wednesday prior. So when they show up to orientation, they actually will show up. You can be proactive instead of being retroactive. And we're not saying that, hey, if you're going to hire 10 people and 10 people are going to show up to orientation, you're getting all 10. We're saying going from 3 out of 10 to 5 out of 10. Those extra 1 or 2 employees will really matter. And that's really what we're trying to focus on, is shaving those percentages so those numbers continue to go in a proper trend. That's kind of the big things that always jumped out with me.
Thanks. And back to Catherine and Ryan, two-part question. What have you found most difficult in onboarding caregivers? And then what have you found that works well in onboarding caregivers, at least from your agency's perspectives? We can start with Catherine.
So what works well for us is we've realized that we need to have more of a tailored program. The goal always is to bring people in expeditiously as possible and, take them through a generic program. And it's recognizing that that may not work for everyone. It's not a cookie cutter generic onboarding situation. So we have to be a little bit more patient and recognize that each person is coming with a different capacity of what they already know in terms of their knowledge, their skill set, etc. So we're working to tailor make it so that we're not on this road that is going way too fast for the applicant. We find that that's when they're going to become frustrated, and that's when they're going to say, is this the right thing for me? So we need to be mindful of how do we keep on our plan, on our roadmap that we've created, but tailor make it for each clinician or each person that we're bringing into the organization. That's what we look at to. It's one of the things we're changing to see how we can be a little bit different and how we can adapt to, the person that is our audience. And one of the things that also resonated with me was, make sure from a language perspective that some of the frustration is, people not necessarily understanding whether it's written or other communication. It would be more helpful for them if they had other options and translations and things of that nature. That's a lot of what we're seeing with some of our population as well. In terms of what works good for us and, who we are, it's really, I think, being adaptable to each person along the way and really figuring out what each person needs instead of, getting there too quickly.
Thank you, Ryan.
Yeah, I would say one of the things we're finding most difficult with onboarding caregivers, and usually there's kind of like a heads and tails to all this stuff. So either it's working well or it doesn't work at all, is remote filling out of paperwork. That seems to be very difficult, and it seems that in person helping them fill out the documentation to apply and be an employee is ideal. We find that if we send out the paperwork through some type of service, whether it's a DocuSign or something along those lines, it can be very hit and miss if that gets filled out or not. And it becomes kind of a catch-22 where if you ask them to fill out the paperwork beforehand to do that, then do the interview, you may never get to the interview. But if you do the interview beforehand for them then to not do the paperwork, then you've wasted an hour of your time on the interviews. So we're really trying to have caregivers come into the office to do the interview and do the paperwork, unless we really feel that they're strong with those the technology side of things. What have we found that works well with onboarding caregivers? Certainly kind of that interaction. We do like that quite a bit, especially since we do a fair amount of training. So we are making sure that somebody's always available for them with the training platforms that we use to have discussions about it, go over any of the questions, over any of the concerns that they have, and then help them navigate any difficulties they have with that the training program. So I think what we're seeing in general on a broad scan is that the difficult side is the remote and the virtual, while the things that are working well that we find is the in-person and the collaborative nature of onboarding and training.
Thank you. I don't know if Paul or Tara had anything to add on this. What works well, what might not. Sort of the entire report's underlying theme.
I have something that's like, it's just interesting very much in the study itself, but 97% of the caregivers that completed the survey in this report used a phone or a tablet.
Oh, Paul, what's even one, we took it even one step further and said, let's ask what types of things they do on their phone. And of course we'd expect, surfing the web and like social media, those would be easy things. But it actually surprised me. It was something like over 60% do their banking online. And so to me, if you can do that, I think, to your point, Ryan, that can be a really tricky thing to deal with, what their appetite for adopting technology can be. But I think what it comes down to is breaking it up into bite-sized chunks. Like, how it is when you're filling out a survey and it's like, oh my gosh, I thought you were just asking me a few questions. And then it's like, oh, that opens up another list. And oh, that opens up another list. And it's like, if you can get the things you need at the points in time where you actually need them, people can follow it a little bit easier. So I think when it's done right, it's done well. But I think you're right, Ryan. If it's more just like, here's a DocuSign and then there's questions and they don't know and there's confusion, like that's tough to handle. So I'd agree, Paul.
Thank you. And then last, as we were preparing for the panel, I forget who had said it, but the topic came up of sort of what makes your agency different than the agency down the street. And so the question is sort of that, what makes your agency different than the agency down the street? Or are you thinking about that regularly? Is that part of the culture in your agency that you're talking about that on a consistent basis to either of you, Catherine and Ryan?
Sure. Excuse me. So, I think one of the things for our selling points is in bringing people in, we talk about our tremendous history. We also talk about our exceptional clinical excellence. we talk about our clinicians with their long tenure. When we look at many of them have 25, 30, 35 plus years, that really resonates to a lot of people throughout the interview process as well. We try to be, from an employee perspective, we try to do a lot of different things throughout the year in terms of employee relations and bonding. And part of our struggles are that, most of our population, 80% of our population, is not physically in the building. So what can we do to bring them back when it's convenient for them, whether it's a breakfast or some other thing? But in terms of, why somebody would want to come work for us, I think it's our history, our reputation, and our longstanding tenure and our tremendous, clinical excellence by being a 4.5-star agency. I think some of our challenges and struggles are that there are many agencies that are close by who have very similar names, and people confuse us with them. And so it's re-educating and getting out there and letting people know, no, that's not our agency. This is our agency as well. But really helping to promote who we are as an organization with long-term exceptional clinical care.
Yeah, so I guess my perspective on things is, I remember years ago reading Richard Branson's kind of autobiography, and in there he talked about how he didn't believe that the client was always right, and he said that to be not a client-focused company, but an employee-focused company, and if the employees are happy, they will take care of your clients. And I think that's what home care has become, and I think that's where we've shifted things over the last few years at Minute Women. The fact of the matter is that there are going to be more clients than we can service with the caregivers that we currently have. The caregivers right now are in low numbers, and we need to be able to onboard and retain great caregivers. And thus, because of that, we will have really happy clients who will then spread the word about the services that we have. So I think one of the things that we've been really focusing on at Minute Women is how can we become the best caregiver-focused agency that we can humanly be. And I think that will allow us to be able to recruit more caregivers, because word of mouth will allow us to be able to bring those caregivers in. And then our clients will be happier, which will, through word of mouth, allow us to get more clients. So that's kind of what our focus has been over the last few years. And that's where I think kind of the home care agencies are going to continue to kind of trend in that direction.
Both. I'd welcome Paul or Tara. Any additional thoughts? Those are the questions we had outlined. I also want to allow folks on the call to ask anything. I don't see anything in the chat right now, but if you have a question, either speak up or raise your hand. Okay. Well, we do appreciate you joining today. I thank Catherine, Ryan, Paul, and Tara for assisting us in pulling this together for the members. Like I had said, we will send out the link to the report itself after this. The webinar will have been recorded as well, so we will send that as well to the membership. I can share Paul and Tara's contact info as well if you'd like to reach out to the Viventium for any other needs. But thank you again to everyone, and thanks for joining.
Thank you so much, Jake.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jake. Have a great day.